Hello, Peter Forsana Azir Osiris, and welcome to my review for Killer is Dead. Wow, when people say this game is weird, they really do mean weird. This is perhaps one of the most, shall we say, unique games that I had played this entire year. From the visual style, to the way it tells its story, to some of the gameplay mechanics it introduces, and etc. Killer is Dead truly does stand out from most of the games that was released this year. But ultimately, weird doesn't always mean good. So the question is Killer is Dead in all its weirdness an enjoyable experience as well as a memorable one? Or is the weirdness factor taken a bit too far? Well, let's find out and begin this review. Killer is Dead is an action-adventure slash hack-and-slash game that was developed by Grasshopper Manufacture and published by Xseed games. This game is available on the PS3 and Xbox 360. I'll be playing the Xbox 360 version of the game.
Killer is Dead.
Visually, the game looks beautiful with the cel-shaded graphics looking visually appealing, stylish, and pretty unique with the graphical style having this noir style to it. Albeit I do think it takes the noir style a bit too far at times, with me thinking the game is overly dark at a few instances, but all in all it looks wonderful for the most part. I also found the character design to be pretty slick. Well, most of them, though I do find that the enemy design to be a bit samey at times. Environment wise, I say it looks pretty decent, with there being a variety of levels that you'll be going through, from an Alice in Wonderland theme level, to a level where you're on a runaway train, and etc. Though I'd probably say my favorite level in terms of design is probably the Yakuza level. The special effects looks pretty decent as well, and the animation is fairly good. Sound design wise, in terms of both sound effect and voice acting, I thought they were pretty adequate to fairly good. Though I did find Mika's voice to be a bit annoying at first, but I got used to her pretty quickly. And if you don't like the English voice acting, there is an option to choose the Japanese voice acting. And the soundtrack is also pretty good, with most of the music and the tracks comprising of techno music and rock music, which are great to listen to. Story wise? Oh man, where to begin? I guess you can begin by saying that you play as Mondo, an employee of a government agency which is tasked with, well...
It's a monster.
Right, a monster.
We kill monsters!
Killing monster for the state. Well, that's why I think that's what their agency do anyway. And the rest of the story is basically him doing his job, basically. Though there are a few episodes that explore Mondo's past. The story overall is bizarre, to say the least. The story in Killer Dead follows a Monster of the Week structure, with it being very episodic, with Mondo having to take out unusual targets in each episode, which ranges from him having to execute a Yakuza boss who has a living tattoo, to him having a job which requires him to travel to the moon, and also having a job which requires him to stop a runaway train by executing it. Yeah, you heard that right. Mondo executes a train in this game. With a sword. Yeah. And that's just a few of the episodes. Though, despite saying that, Killer is Dead does have a main plotline, as quite a few of the targets that Mondo will meet is connected by a certain plot device, and the main plot mostly incorporates how Mondo deals with said plot device. But overall, the story is interesting in that the individual episodes are usually out there and bizarre, that they really draw you in, especially with how the story is told in Killer is Dead. But there's one main problem I have with the story, which is I find that the ending of the game is very unsatisfying. It ends on a cliffhanger. It doesn't really answer any questions we had prior to the main plotline episodes. Well, it answers a few questions, but not as much as I would have wanted. And in the end, it raises more questions. So yeah, not a fan of the ending at all. And overall, I think the story is at least interesting and able to draw you in, just because of how the stories and episodes are usually so weird, out there, and bizarre that you get drawn to them just because of their craziness. Which in turn piqued my curiosity about the world and characters of Killer is Dead, which overall got me pretty invested in the story in Killer is Dead initially. The sad thing is, the game ending does not satisfy my curiosity, instead make me ask even more questions. But if there's one element which I say is the best element in the story in Killer is Dead, it's that it's never boring. Yeah, the very weird parts of the game does approaches the silly threshold, and this is coming from me, a person who's able to suspend his disbelief by quite a lot when I'm playing a video game. But all in all, it is never boring. So that's a plus in my books. Character wise, I say they're entertaining as well, but do suffer from characterization in that we don't really know much about them by the end of the game. So I personally never really got invested in the characters of Killer is Dead. Though we do get to see a glimpse of Mondo's past. Though the ending of the game does get us to raise more questions by the end for Mondo. But overall, I find the characters still being pretty generally enjoyable, entertaining, and fun. And overall, I say the presentation is weird but very entertaining. In terms of gameplay in Killer is Dead, it plays out like a hack and slash game, where you mostly be hacking and slashing through enemies in a number of missions, which ranges from the 12 story missions, the sub missions, Scarlet challenge missions, and lastly you have the Mondo Girl missions, which try to change up the gameplay with it consisting of playing the Gigolo mode. For this review, I'll first talk about the mission structure, then go into the combat system of Killer is Dead. Then I'll talk about Gigolo mode. Oh joy. Anyway, in Killer is Dead, you have a variety of missions to go through, which you're able to pick in a level select screen, which ranges from the 12 story missions, which are pretty typical hack and slash levels, in which you go from point A to point B, with you killing enemies along the way till you reach the boss at the end of the stage and then beat them. Then you got the sub missions and Scarlet challenge missions, which are basically just optional missions, which ranges from time trial missions where you have to fulfill certain conditions. Like there's a mission where you're in an elevator where you have to make sure there's only 2 enemies left on the platform or the platform won't raise. Levels where you go back to a portion of a story mission level and just go through that by killing enemies, going from point A to point B without any bosses, and etc. Oh, and there's the Mondo Girl missions. Yeah, I talk about that later when I'm talking about Gigolo mode. There's also a ranking system at the end of each level which tells you how well you did. You'll also be able to go to Mondo's office, which allows you to buy items which are either gifts for Gigolo mode or Mika tickets, which has an effect on combat. You'll also be able to buy different gems there, and I will get to talk about what gems are in Killer is Dead when I get to the combat system. And at the end of the game, you'll also be able to buy different costumes. And overall, I think the mission structure in Killer is Dead is pretty typical of a hack and slash game, with a few oddball missions here and there. This, along with there being quite a good number of missions you can do in the game, which means this game does have a decent amount of content, and I say the mission structure overall is pretty decent. Okay, now to get to the combat system. Now, as I said at the start of the gameplay portion of this review, Killer is Dead plays out like a hack and slash game, with you being able to do a standard attack, guard break attack, doing a special attack called Adrenaline Burst, being able to use projectile attacks with Mondo's mechanical arm, or using a drill attack, along with being able to guard and dodge against enemy assaults. And dodging at the right time will allow Mondo to do a special counter attack, and blocking at the right time will allow him to parry him. You can also use a slow spin attack that Mondo has, though I personally never really use that attack. Throughout the majority of the game, you basically be using a combination of the attacks I mentioned earlier, standard attack, guard break attack, the special dodge, counter attack, etc. to kill enemies, along with trying to build up a combo meter and building up the blood meter. And speaking of the blood meter is basically a meter that allows Mondo to do a few of his special abilities, which ranges from him being able to use his projectile attacks more effectively, while being able to use his entire mechanical arm effectively, to using Adrenaline Burst, which is a special attack which one hit kills most enemies, as well as healing, which you get through upgrades. And speaking of upgrades, there are several upgrades you can get which can give Mondo more moves like thrust attack or an attack that launches enemy to the air, though do note that you can't jump in the game, so you're basically just slashing them from the ground when they're in the air, so you do have to pay attention to enemy placement, as well as passive abilities like having the ability to auto heal or having an ability which enables Mondo to attack faster if the combo chain is relatively high, which means you can damage the enemy more and build up the blood meter even faster, and etc. Now the last thing I talk about in terms of the combat system is the Last Judgment mechanic, which in turn requires me to talk about gems in Killer is Dead. As you defeat enemies, you will get a variety of different gems, which ranges from increasing your HP, blood meter, getting special points that you can use to get various upgrades, and also health gems to replenish your health. Now the Last Judgment mechanic is basically a mechanic that allows you a chance to earn more of these particular gems by finishing off an enemy with a high combo count, which in turn allows you to finish off an enemy with 4 different type of finishers, and the finishers will increase the amount of gems you get. What type of gems you get in increase is dependent on the finisher you do. Oh man, I almost forgot about the revive option. During battle, Mondo does have a chance to revive himself with the help of Mika if his HP reaches 0, which is strangely represented by crystals for some reason. This option will allow you to continue the battle as is, rather than just going back to a checkpoint system, and you're able to do this to a maximum of 3 times, unless you buy more Mika tickets in the office menu. But there is a small catch to it. You do have to play a small minigame in order to revive Mondo, in the form of Mika trying to resuscitate Mondo through the use of CPR. And I use CPR in parentheses because, you know. And the more times you die, the harder the minigames become. Overall, the combat is fast paced, the control works really well for the most part, dodging feels really good when you're able to do the special counter attack, which is really satisfying to pull off, and the same can be said for parrying. Mondo's right arm shooting mechanics work well enough, with Mondo's projectile attacks doing a decent amount of damage, along with the ability to one headshot an enemy, which makes it both a viable option and really satisfying to pull off. Though do note that headshot won't work on enemies that can guard, so basically we're only using a headshot against enemies that have projectile attacks, though it's still pretty satisfying to pull off a headshot. And Mondo's other mechanical armed abilities like the drill, free shot, etc. is pretty useful. And I also find the blood meter to be an okay mechanic. It does encourage players to go more on the offensive, since attacking the enemy more will build up the blood meter more, which in turn will make Mondo's mechanical arm abilities even more effective, and you being able to use Adrenaline Burst, which does add to the fast-paced nature of Killer is Dead. And speaking of Adrenaline Burst, I do find it an okay-ish addition, as it does feel pretty satisfying to pull it off when you build up enough blood. And do note that you do need to use Adrenaline Burst for some enemies, but mostly the gold-plated enemies. Though it does make healing a bit OP at times. What do I mean by that, or what's the correlation between healing and Adrenaline Burst? Simple. Healing, as the name implies, is an ability that Mondo can use to heal himself, and at higher levels it can heal quite a lot with lesser amount of blood. But the downside to healing, or the supposed downside to healing, is its long animation. Though that downside can be negated completely by going to Adrenaline mode and going out of it, which will cancel the healing animations. So yeah. And also, building up the combo meter feels extremely satisfying with the Last Judgment mechanic, not only in visual flair as you see the stylish finishers you can do when you build up a relatively high combo meter, but also getting more gems than usual to increase either Mondo stats or allow him to get more upgrades, which overall makes a good feeling of progression. And speaking of the upgrades, I felt that most of the upgrades were pretty good in that you do feel that each upgrade you earn makes Mondo feel stronger. Well, except for auto heal. The enemy variety is also fine. Even though they look the same visually, mechanically, they are a bit different with the type of weapons, so you do have to pay attention to which type of enemies you're facing, especially the Grappler, which is a pretty annoying enemy. The boss fights are also pretty enjoyable for the most part, and there are a few unique boss fights I found in this game. Though do note that to finish off a boss fight, you do need to use the Adrenaline Burst attack quite a few times. So do pay attention to the blood meter. Though even if you do run out of the blood meter, you do have a chance to build it up, as the moment when you do need to use the Adrenaline Burst attack, the boss is in a stun effect, which means you can keep slashing at them until you build up the blood meter to use Adrenaline Burst. And the last thing I have to comment in regards to the combat system is that I really found the revive option to be interesting and interactive. So, all in all, Killer is Dead got an extremely fun and very satisfying combat system to go through. And it's simple in that this game don't really have different type of combos or moves you learn. Outside of a few moves, and even then, Mondo's moveset is still relatively pretty small and simple. But despite me really enjoying the combat system, there are a few gripes I have with it. Firstly, the camera, which I have to say can be pretty bad at times. Yeah, it suffers from the usual gripes of a good amount of hack and slash game cameras where you're not able to see an enemy depending on where you're positioned. But Killer is Dead takes it a bit further, with the camera sometimes moving on its own, which can be frustrating at times. The second problem I have is the quick time events that requires you to mash X. Well, for one particular boss. It's annoying because you basically have to cheat in mashing the X button in order to succeed at said boss. Oh yeah, all talking about that boss fight. Now, I'm not sure if this is only a problem on hard mode, which is the difficulty I went through, but when I got to that certain boss fight, and I had to go through that quick time event that required me to mash the X button, I lost when I was mashing the X button normally. So yeah, that part of the game got really annoying for me. It reminds me of the time in Star Fox Adventure when I reached the test of strength part in the Lightfoot Village. Not a fun time for me. The third problem I have is that the shooting controls feels a bit floaty. But all in all, Killer is Dead is still enjoyable for its combat system, even though I do have quite a few grievances with it. Now I get to Gigolo mode. Oh man, this mode. Lots of people have harped on this mode for being sexist, but I'm not gonna go into that. What I am gonna go into is why Gigolo mode is extremely boring and pointless. Gigolo mode is basically a mode where Mondo takes out a particular lady and tries to swoon her over. He does this by giving her gifts, which you can get from Mondo office menu, but in order to give gifts, he needs to build up his guts meter by taking a sexy shot of the female that Mondo is taking out. Mechanically, it's not all that interesting, in that all you do is take sexy shots in order to build up the guts gauge, look away when the female is not looking at Mondo's way, and when it builds up enough, give gifts, and rinse and repeat till you get all the heart meter filled up. It is extremely repetitive, a bit too long at times, and nothing really changes the pattern. It's basically Mondo looking at the girl and giving her gifts without anything interesting happening. No interesting dialogue, nothing of interest is learned between the characters, no pre-planning preparing the gifts since they'll accept all gifts, and the only difference is between the gifts is how much the heart meter is filled. There is nothing interesting about this mode. Well, I guess besides looking at boobs, I guess. The only reason why people will go through this mode is to get Mondo's other mechanical arm weapons like the drill or freeze shot. And when you get down to it, this is an extremely pointless mode which adds nothing to the game and is tedious busy work at best. Luck-wise, the game took me about 11 hours to complete the game on the hard difficulty, with me doing a few of the sub-missions and challenge missions, and difficulty-wise, the game offers a range of difficulties ranging from easy to hard at the start, with a very hard mode unlocking once you beat the game. Overall, I say that Killer is Dead gameplay is very enjoyable, with the missions being generally enjoyable to go through. The combat, while simple, is very fun and extremely satisfying to go through, and the game offers a decent amount of content, with the most notable flaws being the camera and gigolo mode being entirely pointless. Overall, I say Killer Dead is an enjoyable experience with its great stylish visuals, the sound design being generally good, with it having a pretty good soundtrack. The story is weird and over the top, to say the least, but also extremely entertaining, with most of the characters also being entertaining to watch. The combat is also really fun to go through, with it being a pretty fast-paced combat system, with both the dodging and blocking feeling pretty satisfying to do with the parry and counter-attack options, and the Last Judgment mechanic being equally as satisfying, with both the stylish execution moves you can do and the benefits that can be reaped from using said mechanic. The missions are also generally fun to go through, and there is a decent amount of them to last you for quite a bit. The most notable cons of this game is probably the ending, which doesn't explain a few of the questions you might have had during the course of the story, along with it raising even more questions at the end, as well as you not knowing the characters as much as you want to. The camera is also a pain at times, and gigolo mode is extremely pointless and boring. But considering the overall package, I say Killer is Dead was a pleasant, if weird, experience.